To give it my
Welcome to the Further
okay.
Reformation podcast. I
Sorry.
am Benjamin Hicks, and I'm joined today by Jeremy. How are you doing, brother Jeremy Bundy?
Good, brother. Thanks for having me on.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you, and I think we've been acquainted for a few years now in different contexts. And as I was starting this new podcast project, I thought, what better person to talk to than Jeremy? I know that you've got um, a lot of helpful background and experiences that I think will be helpful to our listeners. But first thing I wanted to talk to you about was your film Antichrist and His Ruin. And I remember back at the uh, Trinity Bible Chapel conference, the Church at War, I think it was called, in 2021, when this film debuted, and it had a massive impact on me in my thinking, um, in my processing some of the issues in recent years. And it's a documentary that I heartily recommend to everyone. And you were um, probably the or one of the primary architects behind that. And before we say anything else and talk about you, where can people find that film and how can they view it?
Yeah, so right now the film is there's a streaming experience online. You can go to asterpress.com, and that's Jacob Realm's publishing ministry, Pastor Jacob. And then you can also buy DVDs through that website as well. So it's all through asterpress.com.
Great. Well, if you haven't watched that already, I recommend it to you. But I think especially for those of us who've lived through the COVID lockdowns in Canada, and especially in the context of the church, it had a very formative impact on many people in just crystallizing some of the thinking they'd had and the issues that were involved. So that's primarily what we want to talk about today. But before we do, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Jeremy? Maybe in particular, how long have you been a Christian, and just anything else you care to share about yourself?
Yeah, so I don't have a flashy story, which is, I mean, praise be to the Lord, right? Because the way that he often does things is through Christian households. So um, I just had faithful parents doing their best to raise me in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and that generation only had certain resources at that time to do so well, and so they thank God that they acknowledged that they could have done something better, but they did what they could to raise me as a Christian, and the Lord definitely used a Christian household to bless me. So.
Praise God. And you have a family right now, right?
I do, yeah. I have a wife of 12 years and two girls and two boys, and one of those boys is still in the womb. So I have another boy on the way.
Well, congratulations. Praise the Lord for that.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's jump into it. So tell me about the origin of this film, Antichrist and His Ruin. How did it come about?
Yeah, so I guess the title comes straight from like a lesser known work of John Bunyan. The book is called Of Antichrist and His Ruin. So that's where the title comes from, and not too many people know about that book, but he wrote it like as a response to James II, who was the Catholic monarch prosecuting Christians in England. And so what makes it more powerful is Bunyan was already in jail for 13 years prior under James II. So he could have just kind of lived his life comfortable towards the end, but instead he used that time to write the polemical book of Antichrist and His Ruin as a way to educate the Protestant Christians of that time to oppose the spirit of Antichrist that was found in James II and his reign.
Very good. So that's the origin of of the title of the book originally, and how did it come to be that you decided to do a film at all, and why that title for your film?
Yeah, so I'm not the one that came up with the idea. That was Jacob. So Jacob and I had worked together through the first set of lockdowns to come up with a video, a short video. It was only about 10 minutes long, called Open Your Church, and it was just an encouragement for the churches that were closing with the government mandates to open their doors. Um, and that was received fairly well. It did fairly well just in the local community that we have here. And then Jacob actually came to me and said, "Hey, I have this other idea. I see a lot of similarities with John Bunyan's life and specifically the book that he wrote of Antichrist and His Ruin." And so he came to me saying, when can we get this next video going? And I asked him, how big do you want this to be? And he's like, "Well, how big do you want to go?" And I just said, let's go full film. You know, go big or go home with it. So I was able to push him towards that, and the rest is history. The funding came in fairly easily because it was such a, everybody just wanted it to end, and people were desperate just to get some sort of content out there pushing against it from the Christian perspective. So
Mm.
the Lord just chose to bless all our fundraising efforts, and the film, you know, was completed. And yeah, so that was Pastor Jacob Riom's idea, and I guess I was just helping him, take that idea and then actually implement it into, like, good video storytelling and good video production. So
Well, we might have some listeners who are American, and just for your benefit, listener, where Jeremy talks about the first lockdowns, right? That would
right,
be in 2020 when
yep.
the COVID so-called pandemic kind of takes hold and everything is shut down. But what may be unique in Canada, at least in distinction to many parts of America, is that there was a whole other wave of things that began in 2021, and I guess December of 2020, and then rolling into the year 2021. And yeah, Pastor Rayum of Trinity Bible Chapel was certainly one of the more prominent vocal voices, courageously speaking about the principle of worshiping God according to his word, even during those times. So, where many of us were still sort of crystallizing our thoughts in 2020, Jacob was doing that hard work together with his congregation. And then by the time the second rolled around, Jacob and the rest of the elders there at Trinity Bible Chapel were very united in that point, to where many churches in Ontario and the rest of Canada were not. And so that's maybe just a little bit of background. Can I just ask, how did you get to know Pastor Jacob?
Honestly, I think I'm I have a cou- I'm a couple I have a couple guy friends at Trinity. Um, you know, being so far spread apart, trying to find your tribe, it just means you kind of gotta get connected with men all over the world now. So I'm quite good friends with a group of guys at Trinity, and every time I go up there, we try to, have a bonfire and eat a lot of meat. So it was through them that they suggested that Jacob reach out to me. I actually didn't even know Jacob before he contacted me just about video production stuff. So that first contact was actually that first video, Open Your Church. And that was the first time that I ever worked with or interacted with Jacob. I knew of him before. Um, I was part of a Harvest Bible Church way back in the day. Don't worry, it was way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've matured past that now. But so I had heard of Jacob, and the nickname that he had when I was a member of Harvest Church was the General. And so he definitely lives up to that nickname. But that was the first time I heard about him, but I hadn't interacted with him until he reached out to me to produce Open Your Church, the short video.
Well, I remember that time, and I remember it was very important for those of us who saw the issue that was involved to have someone speaking clearly about it.
Yeah.
And in many contexts of church life, there was just layers and layers of confusion, I think, through worldly thinking, disrupting the clear teaching of God's word there. But it shows how the Lord is able to use some of these modern technologies in order to penetrate through some of the fog that's going on. So
Yeah.
that is encouraging. Was it so? Prior to that film being produced, what kind of work had you done in video production?
Yeah, so my work in video production has primarily been focused on businesses and how businesses can use video production to grow. I had worked on a number of large corporations doing marketing with video production. So I ended up a number of years ago, I owned my own business in audio production, actually, which we could talk about as arguably the mo one of the more important elements of video production because if the audio is off and you can't hear everything and the music doesn't help tell the story and so on and so forth, like it really just affects the final project, right? But that was my background was actually in audio, music, and some of the on location audio capture. So I was exposed to a lot of really excellent director of photographies through that process, and that's where I began to rub shoulders with guys who just knew how to use cameras and got a little experience behind the camera. And then when we were having our first kid, I kind of freaked out a little bit and didn't want to work for myself anymore. Hindsight's
Hmm.
2020, you know. Um, I began working for a church in production. And I don't necessarily believe that churches should have a guy on staff for production anymore. But back then, it was an immense blessing because I got a chance to use a lot of gear that I just did not have access to. I was able to use a camera and learn how to use the camera and still reach out to the past contacts that I had from my earlier years as a business owner in the audio production world. I got a chance to reach out to a lot of those directors and get tips from them and just learn. And so there was no formal schooling. It all came from experience, but no regrets.
Hmm. Excellent. So, as we've kind of already said, it's the COVID lockdowns that are a big part of the background of this film. But obviously, since the film draws upon our Puritan heritage as well, it's about much more than that. And so, even if you would say, well, the COVID lockdowns were a long time ago, I want to move on, I would still say you should listen to or watch this film because I think it's very helpful for the overall theological and historical background it's bringing.
Mm.
But maybe you could speak a little bit to this. When you just think back about the lockdowns, for me, it seems as though it's almost like a lifetime ago. But at the
Yeah.
time, it was hugely impactful for me. I think that the Lord was working my life in many different ways and forming my own convictions and thoughts as a young minister. But when you think about that time, how do you reflect upon it? As was it similarly clarifying for you?
Yeah, I think clarifying would be the right word, the correct word. I had already figured out my position when that time came. So I was right from the first 2 weeks to crush the curve. And for any listener that doesn't know what that means, we basically had politicians promising us that it was only going to be 2 weeks. If we just locked down for 2 weeks, we would crush the curve. And I remember the moment that came out, I was sounding the alarm from the treetops. I was saying, this is not going to be 2 weeks. This is going to go on. And that 2 weeks turned into 2 years. But, anyways, it was definitely a clarifying time, just with being able to count the cost of going to church. And it was actually a very sweet time for me going to church. I kind of miss it, oddly miss it, just because going to church, yeah. you actually had to have some skin in the game. You actually were risking, you know, being fined. Um, and what we saw in Canada was pastors were going to jail. So even the pastors preaching, it was like far more epic. The preaching just jumped leaps and bounds because there was just a fire there. The preacher was counting the cost as well of going to the pulpit every week, right? So it was a very sweet time. It was, yeah, it was very clarifying. I think I don't know if it's something in my bloodline, but I'm always excited to like defy tyrants. Like it just it comes from second nature. I don't know what it is, but that being said, like my convictions were definitely already in place, and I understood the basic framework, right? Like the basic framework being that the church has jurisdiction in certain areas, and the state has jurisdiction in other areas, um, and the worship belongs to Christ. So I had already had that in place, but there was a lot of particulars that did have to be ironed out. And for me, like, yeah, it was definitely a clarifying time, just deciding even what to do with family and some of these other things that were affected by that, right?
Mm. Yeah, I was ordained in January of 2021, so I was in the
Oh,
thick
wow.
of it from the beginning. I also had family who were in Trinity Bible Chapel already, and I also had some family who were part of Steve Richardson's church in the ARP at that point.
Yeah.
And yeah, so immediately I was connected in that way. It was also the case that my mentor when I was training was John Koopman out in Chilliwack,
Mhm.
British Columbia, and his congregation, together with the other Free Reformed churches in British Columbia, were those who took a principled stand, saying that we're commanded by Christ to worship the Lord. And there it was very onerous. They in British Columbia, they um, they said there's not any number of people that can worship at all, and at different points they held to that standard while also allowing the restaurants to open, the gyms to open, the Jewish synagogue to open, and all these
Yeah.
different things. And I know in the case of the Free Reformed Church in Chilliwack, the government was pushing to arrest all the members of the church, not only the pastor. And of
Wow.
course, you know that there were two pastors who were arrested in Alberta for that principle, and many others who faced significant fines, at least the threat of them. And then
Yeah.
beyond that, of course, there's just the ecclesiastical side of it. A lot of people were dealt with very unjustly by spiritual authority, that where the church was kind of weaponized by the state to require things that the Bible doesn't require, or to pressure people to be silent when they were speaking out. So
Yeah.
it was a awful time, but yeah, through that you start to see that the things that the Lord calls us to are important, right? They
That's
come with
right.
a
Yeah.
cost, but hugely important.
I'm impressed that you went forward with your ordination during that season. I think it speaks to your testicular fortitude.
Oh, thanks, brother. That's very kind of you. And yeah, yeah, you see the Lord's hand in these things, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, I kind of understand what you're saying about almost having a certain um, missing of it. For me, I think that often it goes back to I would have loved to have relived that, only to have seen more churches be more faithful, right?
amen.
To me,
Yeah.
I think the heartbreaking thing was where you saw men who were living beneath what they believed, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
and yeah, in some ways you wonder if they could do it again, would they do it differently? But anyway, that's very much in the background of this film.
yeah,
So I guess if one were to put it in a word, would it be fair to say that it seeks to explain that stand of these pastors, a minority of pastors in Canada and their churches with them, that chose to um, disobey government orders in order to obey the Lord's commands to worship on the Lord's Day. And working backward from that supplies the sort of historical, theological justifications for why that would be the case and also how we got to that point. Would that be a fair summary of the film?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the goal was to tell the stories, make it known what these pastors were going through, and the great growth that came out of their faithful stands too, because there's each story is obviously different, but at the end of the day, there was great growth, whether that be in their congregations or their faith, and great victory for those who stood up, even though some of them were forced to pay fines and lost in court. There was a victory of faithfulness that the Lord blessed them with, and so I think it was designed to make that known, and then also just um, parallel that with some historical events that were almost it was almost freakishly parallel, right? Like
Mhm.
when you understand what the churches had to go through throughout history, you start to understand more in depth what it means that there's nothing new under the sun, right? So um,
Yeah, very, very well said. I mean, in our denomination, the Free Reformed Churches, it was founded under a kind of backdrop of persecution. So in 1834, you have a faithful minister named Hendrik de Kock who's defrocked for opposing the liberalism in the national church in Holland. And his congregation stands with him and leaves the National Reformed Church of Holland. And that sparks an exodus of faithful Reformed Christians across the country.
yeah,
And a large part of that story is that the government at that time, so committed to the liberalism of the state church, persecuted all these groups of Christians who were worshiping in secret, worshiping in barns, worshiping in homes, and facing jail time and fines and so forth. And again, many of the same arguments being coming to play. Does the state have the right to forbid what God commands when they claim the national well-being, or other sort of arguments, or is there actually a law over the state which not only the state is compelled to um, follow, but also that every person is required to examine the state's edicts with and come to a determination as to whether this is something you can follow in good conscience or not.
right. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so history can definitely shed light on that. When Yeah, so the film itself, it consists primarily of interviews from different Christian pastors and theologians who united around shared convictions concerning worshiping Christ under persecution. And I remember when watching it was incredible because those people I knew, those men who had taken a stand. And maybe you want to maybe sketch it a little bit more. What would be some of the threads of conviction that would bind together those different men that you interviewed? Um,
Yeah.
There's a bit of a cross selection, but there are some things in common. So why don't you share that?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say that one of the most encouraging things during production was definitely seeing pastors across multiple eschatologies really take a stand, put those differences aside, and then take a stand and, stand shoulder to shoulder around Christ's authority over worship. That was uh, that was a really encouraging thing to see, a really powerful thing to see during those interviews. It gave a glimpse of what courage in the church should look like. Um, so it was just interesting to see the dispensationalists, and I love my dispensationalist brothers,
Mm-hmm.
rally around Christ as king over the church, and then see the post mill and amill guys, well, Christ is king of the world, including his church. So it was really encouraging to speak to multiple people having multiple convictions into what they believe about the end times and eschatology, put those aside and stand shoulder to shoulder. And that was one of my favorite things about interviewing all these different people because I think I can't remember how many I did because it does seem like a lifetime ago. I think there was at least 20 something interviews that we did. So it was encouraging to see that uniting factor kind of weave itself through all these interviews.
How long does something like that take? How long did you do the interview?
Um, so it was about 3 months of production. So 3 months of filming, and that doesn't include the pre-production and storyboarding and scheduling out all the interviews and stuff like that. So I hit the road for 3 months. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And we
Must have been
weren't
hard on
like,
your
yeah, unvaccinated people weren't allowed to fly either. So it was an interesting time to load the family up in a truck and RV and all the production gear and just hightail it across the country. But yeah,
Oh,
three
great. So
months of being on.
you brought your family with you. That's awesome, man. That's
Yeah,
great.
it was a non-negotiable, and there's no way I'm putting in that much work for a project without taking my family along. So
Oh, that's awesome, brother. I'm happy to hear that.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so yeah, that's an incredible undertaking. I'm sure that was an incredible experience. When I think about those different men, right? I think you're right. There is a real cross selection, right? You have people who um, would come more from a premillennial or dispensationalist perspective, others who come from a theonomic or post-millennial perspective. And I'm sure that in all their different contexts, whether Baptist or Reformed or whatever they were, there were invariably folks within their own tradition and within their own um, stream of ecclesiastical life that were telling them you're just uh, completely off the rails, right? You need to
yeah,
comply with the state. You need to support all these good things that the government is doing. And many of us experience that sort of thing. And so during that time, I found that I had a lot more close fellowship with Baptists or dispensationalists, even Pentecostals, who are clear on those things. But we need to worship the Lord. Than even someone where you'd say on paper they're checking all the boxes, right?
yeah,
They're all, and so it kind of brought it was sometimes I think about it kind of as a coalition. There was like this group of people, and they had a shared commitment to the lordship of Christ and a shared desire to do what was right, even during these confusing times of government overreach.
yeah,
If you, when you reflect upon that and you think about those men and the relevance that they had then, because I think there was a certain prophetic voice they brought to the national
yeah.
conversation. How do you assess that today? Do you think that is still something we can talk about as a coalition, and does it still have relevance today?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something that I've thought a lot about. And I mean, if I had to choose like a yes or no, and there's no middle ground, I would probably choose to say no. I mean, the stand was historic, courageous, and we can look back on that and definitely appreciate it for what it was. And I think the church is better off for that coalition. Now, what I see going on with some of the more recent controversies in Christendom are a bunch of guys who stood against government tyranny, so the government reaching outside of its authority into the church. Now these same guys are acting in well, not everybody, like I don't mean same guys as in the people in the film. I'm just saying that like certain pastors within Christendom today are now reaching outside of their congregations, their denominations, and into other denominations and congregations and causing trouble, which is very clearly outside their authoritative bounds. And when I when I kind of think about that, it comes across to me as very hypocritical. Let's stand against government tyranny, but then let's tyrannize other congregants in other churches and other denominations through overreaching our God ordained authority and causing trouble. And I also see this in the recent movement to turn, issues very I don't like the term secondary issues, but to turn issues that are not issues of orthodoxy into wanting to excommunicate people from the church over those issues. And I think that's, again, an example of pastors operating outside the bounds of authority that God has given them, acting like angry HR ladies rather than a pastor. That's There's a lot of parallel between that happening today and what was going on with the government in 2020, 2021, 2022 with COVID. So that's, I'm just a blue collar guy. I'm I'm not a seasoned theologian or a pastor, but when I look on from the outside in, I definitely see a lot of similarities with the overreach of authority and what the government did during COVID. And I see that kind of playing out within the church today and within the coalition of a lot of guys that were in the film as well.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that, brother, and I have to agree. Obviously, I think that the things you're talking about would not necessarily apply to every person in the film, and you're not saying that it
That's right. Yeah.
does.
I'm
But
not saying that.
yeah, I'm certainly not saying that. I think the thing that comes to mind as you're talking would be the high profile controversy last fall involving Tobias Remenschneider, who is someone who I don't believe you interviewed for your film, but he was certainly a prominent voice within what I would call the uh, the coalition of people standing for the crown rights of Christ during that time. He was a German pastor, and he wrote a prominent declaration at that time laying out sort of the theological perspective of a lot of our men in Canada and in other places that were seeing the problems during the COVID time. I remember signing that declaration about COVID way back whenever it came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And he and some others did seem to interject themselves into a church in Texas and seemed to be applying some of the clout that they'd received through their public ministries and platforms, partially through their stand during that time. And now targeting a very similar kind of church with a view to pressuring them to put a member of that church under church discipline for holding to a revisionist understanding of the Second World War. And I might link to the King's Hall podcast because they had a very good summary of the whole thing,
Yes,
and people
they
are
did.
interested
Yep.
can look into it. I think that there's not much more to be improved about their whole assessment of the whole thing. But
Yep.
in the aftermath of that, you also do have some of the same people around Pastor Tobias putting out the Antioch Declaration, which was seeking again, I think, to marshal some remnants of that coalition around that assembled around the COVID period, American and Canadian
Yep.
voices, and now speaking out on the problems of, say, anti-Semitism within the church, and using that term, I think, in a very broad way,
Hmm.
beyond what would be, justifiable biblically or historically or morally. And I think that is a severe problem. There were many, I think, critical responses to that and many things that were said in response to that as to whether there is a drift from the vision and the principles that were originally bringing these men together. I remember when Stephen Wolfe, the political theorist, in the aftermath of these men coming out very strongly and pressuring the church in Texas to to put someone under church discipline, made the statement on X that if you took a strong stand during the COVID period,
Mm,
but you are serving this political agenda to persecute your brothers, that in effect, I don't have respect for you. That was kind of the essence of what it was saying. This word gets thrown around one of the chats that I'm involved with, where some of us came together during the COVID issues, and men just, enraged at this, right? As though they were as though Dr. Wolf was belittling the principles that we'd stood for. And to me, I thought, no, like that's entirely consistent with the original vision. Namely, you can't have these humanistic, worldly ideologies interfering with biblical truth. So that's my assessment. What do you think about that?
yeah, it is absolutely asinine to think that after what the government did, we would trust the government. And the same with this controversy. It's crazy to me that men would think that you could blindly trust some of these pastors that are involved in this controversy and reaching into other congregations to try and punish punish congregants for these HR policies. I refer to them as HR policies because I think that's accurate. Um, it's crazy to think that we would just go right back to trusting these men, right? And that's just not how it works. And so, yeah, I haven't seen that post by Stephen Wolf on X, but yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
Yeah, appreciate you saying that, brother. So going back to these interviews,
Yeah.
maybe you can say, what was it like to interview all these men at that time? And did you have a favorite interview that sticks out in your mind? And you can take this question in whatever direction you want.
All right. Um, yeah, so it was wild. As I kind of alluded to in the last couple questions here, I took my family on the road. I had a 1-year-old boy at the time who was teething. So if you can imagine spending 3 days just to get out of Ontario because unvaccinated people actually couldn't cross over the border. So for any American listener, it's much faster for us to go out west if we travel down through the United States because we're in southern Ontario. But it takes us 3 days of travel just to get out of Ontario to get to the other parts of Canada because we have to go around the lakes. And so it was a wild time doing that with a 1-year-old teething boy and two other kids. And but yeah, I wouldn't have changed anything for it. Like I said, it was just a non-negotiable to do this with my family. So the Lord provided an RV trailer for us to be able to basically utilize that as my editing suite and take all my production gear with me. And we hit the road for a number of months. As far as the interviews, a lot of people aren't going to understand the level of work that goes into a production like this. So the interviews, like I mentioned, there's 20 something interviews, right? And I'm a stickler with how things look because I think that Christians have missed the importance of beauty, and we need to recapture this in art is the idea that art's not just for utility, it's actually for beauty too. So it I wasn't interested in throwing up a camera as fast as I could and capturing just the content. There was a lot of intentionality that went into where we were doing it. I wanted the background to tell a story, right? I wanted there to be perfect lighting to set the scene properly and to draw out certain aspects of the footage, right? So all of that went into these interviews. So there's probably about 5 hours of setup time, 3 hours of interview time, and then 2 hours of teardown time for every single interview. Um, so I mean, you times that by 20, it was a ton of work. So it was a wild time traveling across Canada and capturing these interviews. As far as a favorite interview, uh, I, Jacob's interview definitely sticks out to me just because by that time I had a relationship with Pastor Jacob and I knew how to press his buttons to get him ranting. So I know that Jacob loves to rant about tyrannical government, and so it was just a matter of time in the interview until I I got him ranting pretty good, and you can see that footage in the trailer. That was the trailer footage where Jacob was just getting fired up and talking about, some of the things that Canada is doing and the government is doing. So I would have to put my finger on that one as one of my favorite interviews, just to be able to roll the camera, sit back,
Mm.
and let Jacob monologue for his rant. So that was definitely my favorite.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I just remember one scene from the film in which you were talking, or the film was giving the history of the passage of the Multiculturalism Act and the adoption of that by the Liberal Party. And Jacob just sort of thunders and says, "This was a direct attack upon the
Yeah.
Christian foundation." Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do have a lot of appreciation for Pastor Jacob, and I know exactly what you mean. He has a way of communicating things with passion that you would hope for some of these important issues.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I know what you mean as well. Like I'm just thinking back to all of the different interviews, and it's definitely not just a copy and paste thing, right? Like there was a lot of um, just symmetry and beauty and how you framed all these different people in these different settings in a church building or in an office or so forth. So when you watch it, it actually is just an impressive thing to see how that's all put together.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that was something that was important to me, and as far as like even Steve Richardson's scene being filmed in a construction building, right? The importance of that scene was just Steve ended up losing his presbytery, removed him from pastoral care, and he ended up having to work some general labor. And so each scene in the movie, uh, as much as I could, obviously there were practical boundaries and stuff like that. So sometimes we just didn't have access to certain locations and stuff like that. But I did try my hardest to actually film in locations that told the story. So a lot of the scenes are in some of the places where churches went underground. So, Jacob is he was locked out of his building, so we filmed in a place where they met for church. And same with Mike Thiessen and some of these other men. Or if, their church was a central had a kind of a central part in the story of what was going on, we'd film in the church as well, just to, you know, again, all those elements together, they come together, and it's not just about the content, it's not just about the message, it's about all these elements of production coming together for something that is beautiful. And I'm not talking about beautiful as in the feminine sense, but like, taking all these elements together and bringing order to it is beautiful in the Christian sense. So,
yeah, absolutely. So one of the prominent themes of the film is that Canada has a Christian founding and has a Christian heritage going back to the Puritans and Reformers. So I think that may be new to some people because it is our ruling class has really done all they can to expunge that thought from the
yeah.
public consciousness. But I think that what I've found most helpful in showing this, I think I've shown this to our men's group a couple times now and watched it a few times with my family, is it really is helpful for getting you grounded historically for thinking that we are in this long line of faithful Christians and that our nation is historically implicated in that. So I'm sure that experience was um, important for you to think through all those things.
Oh,
So maybe you
absolutely.
can answer generally, how can familiarity with the convictions of our fathers in the faith enrich our walk with the Lord? And take that however you want.
Yeah. I think when we study our foundations as a nation, it's not just about studying history. What we're doing is we're obeying the the fifth commandment, right? Honor your father and mother. So to love your place and love your people, I know that's a hot topic right now, but I think a lot of this. is important, right? Because if you take out the foundation from a house, it's not going to stand, right? So, like you mentioned, like we're just getting, whether it's through media, through the public schools, whether it's through taking words like colonizer and trying to add it as a slur, we're conditioned to like really despise the very people who brought light into darkness in Canada, right? And Canada has fallen because it's rejected that foundation. And when the foundation is destroyed, like you don't have a nation anymore. And so part of that was a learning curve for me too, right? Like I'm not a historian, and so having Jacob's guidance on that was definitely helpful and opened my eyes to the fact that wow, like at one point Canada actually had more people per capita going to church than the States did. That was a stat that blew my mind.
Mm,
That's crazy. So I think when we try to reclaim and study the work that our fathers did in bringing the gospel to Canada and the United States, it's truly a way that we can honor them and fulfill the fifth commandment, right?
yeah. Well, amen to that. You mentioned earlier on that the title and some of the themes of the film, they draw upon the person of John Bunyan, who's obviously persecuted under a kind of similar circumstance as our men here in Canada. And you draw upon his book, Antichrist and His Ruin. And the film does sort of make a case for um, this concept of the Antichrist. But if I'm not mistaken, it draws that category at a different place than the way Bunyan would. So, can you maybe unpack that and maybe draw upon your own beliefs? What do you believe is the biblical teaching of Antichrist, and what is that?
Well, I can always have a paradigm shift, which I've had a lot over the last couple of years. So what I believe, I can give you what I believe on it now. And we'll see if that changes over time, but I don't know if it's accurate to say, because I agree with John Bunyan's take and a lot of the reformers take that in their day, it was the Roman Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that Bunyan at least, and maybe I know that other reformers have, but and other Puritans have, but Bunyan at least I think makes room for this Antichrist spirit being able to be applied to other governments who embody the spirit of Antichrist and the state becoming so great and so big and taking so much authority away from from the sphere of the family and the church that you could also make a case that yes, the Roman Catholic Church uh, was embodying the spirit of Antichrist, but today our government is doing the same thing. So I do believe um, that there is an application today for our government embodying the spirit of Antichrist, raising itself against the authority of the Lord. And there's also an application for the state becoming so big and so overbloated that it's gobbling up all freedoms that people would have and operating in a very beastly way. So that's
Mm.
what I believe now, but I'm open to being educated about how I'm wrong. If you think
Sure.
that.
As we all should be, brother. As we all
Well,
should be. Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. When I read First John, which is of course
yes.
the
Yeah.
primary book where we get the actual phrase Antichrist, I would see both things there. So he'll, John will say, "You have heard that Antichrist is coming," right? And then on the
Yeah.
other hand, he'll say, "There are many Antichrists," right?
Right. Yeah.
So I would probably take the concept in a broad sense and in a narrow sense. So the I as I've studied it over the years, it seems as though the prefix anti, which interestingly in the Greek is the same, spelled almost the same with Greek letters as our prefix anti. I don't
Mm.
think it just means opposed to. I think it also means replacing, and that you do see that in the Greek. And so I think the concept of Antichrist under the new covenant is that there are all these shards of gospel truth and of the sort of shape of the truth of the gospel, which the devil distorts in order to turn people away from from Christ himself, right? So I have no problem saying Islam is antichrist. I have no problem saying that Mormonism is antichrist, and even Talmudic Judaism is antichrist, of course, because it is really a response to Christ in his revelation. And I think certainly I would not exclude from that modern multicultural statist tyranny in Canada. I think it's very clear that in Canada, the reason why people went along with the tyranny during COVID is because, in effect, the state is their God, right? So
That's right. Yeah.
they'll believe things that are contrary to common sense and contrary to science and contrary to empirical proof because the government says so. And,
That's
you
right.
even have people who profess to be Christians and they'll say, well, I know the Bible says X, Y, and Z, but the state says A, B, and C. And so that's what I'm going to do. Well, insofar as you're doing that, you're treating the state as your antichrist, right? So I
Yeah.
agree with all that. I guess what I would still say though is that you can still have that and recognize it while still holding that there is a single consummate, you know, manifestation of that in the Pope of Rome. And I suppose I still do hold to that with John Bunyan. I know it is a minority position today, but if I would give you something to think about, it would be the original Westminster Confession and what they draw out there, but also especially the proof text in Second Thessalonians chapter 2. And I think there is more of an understanding of something that's the fitting much more of the pattern of what you see in the Pope of Rome. But
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
all to say
interesting.
is
I'll
it
check
didn't really denigrate from my enjoyment of the film, but you can respond to that.
it out.
Anything you would respond to that, brother?
No, to be honest, I have not done a deep dive into the subject. So, I'm taking when we were storyboarding everything, I do have to take certain cues from the executive producer, which would be
Mhm.
which would be Jacob, right? So, I mean, I
Mhm.
learned, just from 21 different people or however many people I interviewed, I can't remember, but hearing their takes on it, it's like I kind of took all that and tried to weave a story together. But yeah, I have not admittedly done a really deep dive into the reformed view of Antichrist. So I guess I'll have to add that to the list of things I got to figure out.
That's fair. I remember listening to the part where you're interviewing Nate Wright, and Nate Wright sort of tries to say that in Revelation, the beast is primarily Nero, and that's the emperor, right? So that
Yep.
follows from a pretty standard partial preterist post millennial interpretation, which I know he holds to.
Yeah.
Um, and and I think that for if you want to go specifically to Revelation, then it's going to depend upon whether you find that overall hermeneutic persuasive, whether that's the first meaning of that passage. But
Yeah.
I definitely don't think that the way it was phrased I thought was very careful to say that it is application beyond that.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I personally would have a different understanding of Revelation there, but I also appreciated how it was saying that if you see that in Revelation, regardless of when you believe that the beast is realized, whether it's a single consummate expression of Antichrist or whether it is, a sort of perennial problem that we're seeing. Regardless, the principle's still there, and any one of us who are living through that time could see that this was what we were living through in some form. That the
Mhm.
state is speaking as God and is denigrating the worship of God.
Yeah.
Good. So, just a couple more things here, brother. Yeah, do you want to talk a bit about this whole issue of multiculturalism? So, this was what surprised me about the film when I first watched it, but what I really appreciated, which was you don't just talk about statism, but multiculturalism, particularly as a problem and as a significant attack upon our Christian founding. So, did you receive any pushback from that position, and how do you reflect upon that today?
Yes, we did. Um, I mean, most of it came from the trailer. So when the trailer was launched, any trailer is meant to leave more questions than answers, right? I mean, the trailer is supposed to create some sort of curiosity to get you to watch the film. So most of the pushback actually came from the trailer that we released. And there was actually a lot of pushback within the people that were in the film. So some people in the film actually had to be talked off a ledge, so to speak. And it was understandable. I mean, the trailer was pretty aggressive, but I think once they saw how we analyzed it in the film and how we basically took that and gave an answer to it, I think that's when they said, okay, like this makes sense, right? But it was it's a hot word, right? And I think we're in a battle for the dictionary, and so a lot of people's concern with the word using the word multiculturalism was that today it's used to mean something totally different than what it meant, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Um, now I I don't even like the word culture anymore because it, in the earliest dictionaries it's not even there. And so I've had a little bit of a mindset shift when it comes to these words, and I think it's important to actually go back and study the etymology of words. But yes, we did receive a little bit of pushback from that, but I think those who actually watched the film, which most people did because they wanted to know the answer to that question, were satisfied with the answers it gave. And then once the documentary came out, we actually didn't receive very much pushback at all with what we were saying. And if we did, maybe it was just within government ranks, and maybe we were getting doxxed behind government doors. I don't know. There was not a lot of criticism that met my ears. It didn't make its way to me after the documentary came out. So
Hmm. Yeah, in some ways, it's not that it wasn't a subject of conversation at the time, but certainly in my own thinking, uh, issues of statism were really at the forefront of my thought coming out of 2021 and into 2022. And so I think that it helps it stand the test of time um, as an historical work, as a polemical theological work, because since that time in both Canada and the United States, there's been much more discussion about what is a nation and what is
yeah,
a proper way to think about national identity and a proper way to think about immigration policy. Frankly, I think
yeah,
that it's not primarily the subject of your film, of course, but in the minds of the Liberal Party, from my own assessment, the multicultural ideology was a pretext to elect a new people, for lack of a better word, right? To transform the population in a way to cement their utopian globalist far left agenda and to make it beyond the reach of the historic Canadian population to ever reverse. And that, obviously you have the smaller parties like the PPC in Canada that try to really tap into that concern. But even the mainstream parties have had to recognize that as much as they may not wish to talk about it, there is a much more awareness in the last 5 years, I would say, of the effects of that policy, which perhaps our forefathers around the time of Pierre Trudeau didn't appreciate.
Yeah. And it's important to go back and understand that this was like the COVID conflict wasn't, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere too, right? It was the results of a lot of hard work from the statists to bring it in, and one of the tools that they used was definitely multiculturalism. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely a hot topic today, and I think the film does a good job of at least educating the listener on going back and seeing where that turn really was in our nation. So praise the Lord for that.
So no one can deny that the film is an incredible artistic achievement. I encourage people, even if you just watch, even if you might be skeptical whether you'll find it to your liking, just watching there are so many just graphics and little animated portions that make it very captivating. So I was very blessed by it. But maybe uh, in terms of those things, so after you've shot the whole thing and you've done all the planning for it, what kind of hours were involved in bringing that to completion?
Yeah. It's hard to overstate, yeah, how much work goes into the thing. So on the production side, I mentioned we filmed a lot of interviews and the setup time and the teardown time. And you know, um I would say like it was definitely a team effort. It wasn't just me. So while I was on the road filming, my good brother Tim Tyso, I was sending him hard drives and he was organizing footage and taking the audio and video and putting it together, and he started editing like a rough story along our storyboard that we had. And then I had a team organizing all the interviews and scheduling everything. And I would just reach out to them and be like, where am I going next? Right. So they would tell me where to go, and I'd drive there and set up for the next interview. But it's I think at one time I had I had timed how long it took me to get through 6 minutes of video, and I had that at 150 hours, and it's a 2.5 hour documentary. So you can
Mm.
imagine the man hours that went into that, and that was just to get that 6 minutes of video to a place where I could send off to get signed off on. So that's not audio mixing and audio mastering, and that's not, final tweaks and stuff like that. That's just to get something with music and graphics and animations to get it firmed up so that it could get signed off on from Jacob. So, I mean, it was a massive undertaking. And actually, there's a funny story here. So, I'm in BC, filming the interviews with John Koopman, and I'm on a remote beach in like the middle of nowhere, and Jacob calls me up and he's like, "Hey, brother, do you think you could have this edited for the conference in the fall?" And without thinking through that, my answer, I was like, "Oh yeah, no problem." And so I got myself into a little bit of trouble once I got back with post-production, but the whole film, which is 2.5 hours long, doesn't feel like 2.5 hours for your listeners too. I really worked hard to make it cinematic storytelling so that I took 2.5 hours and made it feel like maybe an hour. So I'm hoping that's your experience if you choose to watch it. But um, I yeah, I edited that whole thing in 2 months, which was not good for my health. But and I probably won't do something on that timeline again, but it's a testament to the Lord's faithfulness in sustaining me during that. And I learned a lot. Yeah, I'd say I learned a lot from just hiding away and having to make an intense deadline. It definitely made me a better business owner. So
Yeah. Wow. I can only imagine. I remember when I think maybe the first time I saw you was at the conference, and you were being interviewed right after the filming of it. And I remember you saying something like you had just finished up the final touches right before it was shown, or like
yeah.
shortly after. Am I remembering that?
Yeah, it was I think if my memory serves correct, it was 24 hours before that I had sent off the final version to the guys at Trinity, and then after that there were a few more tweaks before going to the public. But yes, it was yeah, we were burning the midnight oil to get it done for that conference for sure.
Well, I'll just say this, brother. You know, I think anyone can get a lot of profit from the film by watching it, but there will never be an experience like watching it that night at the conference.
Yeah,
Because for a lot of us, we had lost friendships, sometimes strains in our families. Some of us had undergone persecution, ecclesiastical or governmental, and so, I remember just sitting there and just watching the whole story with my wife and experiencing that was something I'll just never forget. It was like they were sharing
yeah,
our story
yeah,
and allowing us to sort of process it and to heal from it. But also, it ends on a very positive note, directing us to the Lord, directing us to the purposes of his kingdom and the
yeah.
need to be faithful. And yeah, so I want to thank, it may have been stressful, but I think the fact that it was able to be shown at that conference was hugely impactful for many people. So thank you.
Yeah, that was definitely a blessed time. So praise the Lord for that.
Yeah. So it might be a bit of a negative thing to think about, but I think we probably should, and that is that some people in the Christian community maybe have an unrealistic thing about unrealistic set of beliefs about this kind of art. And the idea is that, well, you've done this work, you should really maybe do it for free, or you should, we should just assume that it sort of materializes. So, if you want to speak frankly, do you think that some Christians have a socialistic perspective when it comes to the art that they wouldn't bring to something else?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we saw this firsthand. So when we went to distribution, we had built a custom streaming experience and allowed everybody to have a lifetime access to it through the online portal, and we pressed DVDs. And when we went to distribution and we finally started advertising it, it was probably one of the most frustrating things about working on it was to get comments every day saying this needs to be free because this people need to hear this and they need to hear the gospel, and so you should, why are you charging for this? Jesus would never do something like that. you know and that like we would get a number of those comments daily, and it was definitely frustrating. But that mindset, when it comes to art is definitely pure socialism. So it's the idea that only art exists for utility, right? It's that that if a piece of work doesn't loudly scream a simplified and truncated gospel presentation, that basic, you're a sinner, you need to repent, follow Jesus, then it's ultimately worthless. That's the kind of view that these people are bringing on to art, right? But I would argue that it's not biblical, and it doesn't fall in line with historical Christianity, because God doesn't create like that. He doesn't create sunsets that are screaming, repent and believe, right? He doesn't. His work in nature can exist for just beauty. And in Exodus, you have the example of when he was telling Aaron on what he should do to his robes, and he describes his instructions as this is all for beauty and for glory. So I think
Mm.
there's this attitude towards art that people have where they've kind of truncated it down into just needing to be, in order for it to be Christian, it needs to explain, it needs to give a clear and concise gospel presentation. But I don't think that you would see that view throughout history in regards to Christian art. We used to pay millions of dollars for people to paint cathedrals, and people would be content hand carving bricks on cathedrals that they would never see finished, and they were content with beautiful architecture and some of these things just existing for beauty's sake. And so I think that's a sentiment that we need to capture within Christendom, that art can actually exist solely for beauty.
Mm.
And when that mindset is in place, when something can exist just for beauty, you understand that the artist needs to get paid. It was kind of like offensive to me that I would put in this much work, and I tried not to be a little baby about it, but it was kind of offensive to me that I would put in so like I mean, and it was roughly a year and a half of my life, right? So it was frustrating to put in that much work and to put in that much excellence and then have people say, well, like, come on, you could just do that for free. And those same people, the frustrating thing is those same people will turn around and just say, man, we need more Christian art. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
how do we get that, right? It literally can't exist without funding. Like I don't do this full time because there is no way to provide for a family and be a Christian artist without massive amounts of funding. So if the people don't want to fund it, um, we're not gonna get we're not gonna get Christian art. It's Brian Sauvé actually talks a lot about this and in a fantastic way, being an artist himself. He breaks down all the numbers that go into his music projects, right? And he says, like, this is how much I'm making from my music, and this is how much it costs me to do the music, right? And I mean,
Mhm.
the graph is like, there's no return on investment financially from creating Christian art, right? The returns are in other areas. And so people need to understand that we cannot have a socialistic view of art. We will there will be no Christian art if that's our view,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, and one of the themes of the film is that the lordship of Christ comprehends all of life, right? So if we
right,
are
yeah.
saying Christ is Lord, it is not only a soteriological statement, but it also has political and cultural implications as well.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
yeah, I agree with what you're saying, brother. Ultimately, um, yeah, the Belgian Confession has a phrase that God is the overflowing fountain of all good. So if beauty is good, we have to believe that it comes from God, that it reflects the character of God.
Yeah.
And so a proper Christian perspective is also going to recognize that. So
Yeah. And if
I
you look
appreciate
at
you saying.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say that if you look at who was winning during COVID, it was those who were telling the best stories. It wasn't those who were just
Mhm.
spitting facts. I mean, you could spit as many facts as you could possibly spit, but that wasn't the narrative that was winning during that time, right? It was whoever could tell the best story in the most well done way. And so I think that definitely we have to be thinking through those things as Christians too. We have to be telling the best stories in the best way possible, and the only way we can do that is if we get support from other Christians to be able to do that. So yeah, there was definitely a level of hypocrisy too with wanting to call out socialism and then demanding that we give the doc away for free. I found that quite humorous as well. Oh, the state is just the state is so socialist. Why aren't you giving us this film for free? Yeah,
Yeah, well, you know what? It may take longer for um, the socialistic mindset to get out of Canadians. It's a process of sanctification, I suppose. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah, maybe even just talking about it here will get people to have a different and a better mindset about it. And we can, of course, hope that it will generate people who have some capital, whether small or great, to support Christian artists. So I think
yeah,
that's important.
for sure.
So maybe just as last thought, if you had the opportunity to do another project like this, what would it be if you had the opportunity?
Oh man, can my answer be anybody who has funding and has a good story to tell? Can that, can that be the answer?
If
Um,
it's the answer, it's what it is.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty much the answer. I mean, I'm passionate about I'm passionate about maybe doing a project, and these are all maybes. They're like obviously the Lord would have to make things work and bring things together to do it, but I think feminism is a massive uh is a massive problem in churches And I think getting very detailed about how it's actually worked itself into churches where churches don't even know it's there would be huge because there's been documentaries on feminism, but I still think that there are problems within maybe even some of those churches that have done documentaries on feminism where it's
Mhm.
just made its way in and it's a sneaky cancer that needs to be put to death. And I think even like even us growing up in Canada, I think we have some, you know, blind spots in regards to feminism that I think people could that we could see, right? And we could deal with. So I think a documentary going into depth about how it's this sneaky cancer that has worked its way into to Christianity would be beneficial. You and I have talked about possible projects centering around Christian nationalism as well. So
Mhm.
that would be something that would be a fun project as well. I might get in trouble for that one, but
Well, I hope not, brother, because I agree with you. I think that yeah, that is certainly a subject of important discussion these days, and it's
yeah,
one that I think is hugely important to me. I think that that flows very logically from what we were standing for during the COVID times. That
yes, yeah,
if we're going to say that our country has a Christian founding and that the nations should be Christian, then I don't know why we would distance ourselves from a movement that has done excellent work on that same subject. I don't agree with some of my friends and brothers in the movement that's centered around COVID issues to say, well, there's a big discontinuity with what, say, Stephen Wolfe is advocating for, or what the Ogden men are advocating for. To me, I think it's the logical extension for what um, we were standing for then. And to me, I think that failure to understand some of those issues is why there's maybe less relevance among some voices today. And I don't say that with relish. I would love to see a more constructive mindset on these things, courageously standing on the issues that are presently at play, rather than only those that were at play a number of years ago. So that's my assessment of it at any rate. Any uh, any pushback on that, or any thoughts on that?
well, I guess the cat's out of the bag now. I guess I'm a Christian nationalist, so for anybody that
Very
didn't know,
good.
thanks Ben, thanks Pastor Ben.
Do, doing what I can to get my friends in
Yeah.
trouble. That's what
Yeah.
I do. So
No,
feel
it's
free
an
to, yeah.
interesting thought to think through some of the natural outflowing from the COVID time into what we're facing now, and I'm not sure I've worked that out in ways that you have. So I think that's a conversation we'll have to keep having because this is yeah the first time I've kind of seen it articulated in that way. So I on the surface, hearing it for the first time, I would agree with it. And I think it would be a great project to bring some clarity to the movement as well. And yeah, so if anybody's listening that has capital,
There we go. So if you're a wealthy investor, then shoot us
yeah.
a contact, and we're ready to talk. Okay? But I also take your willingness to have further conversations, brother, as an invitation for me to bring you back on this podcast. So I think um, we've shown that there are some important things to discuss also going forward. So I look forward to being in conversation with you about that. So until next time, listeners, I commend to you the film Antichrist and His Ruin. And do you want to remind people where they can find that again, brother?
Yeah, it's acerpress.com. I know it's wasn't wasn't my doing to put it on that domain, but Acer was John Bunyan's bibliographer. Is that no, it's not bibliographer. It's his autobiograph, or it's his biographer, I think, or is that what is that who he was? I can't remember.
I'm not sure, but in any case, if that is the website, then they'll be able to find the film, and And that's a good, I'm sure that they'll also find some other good material on that website, knowing who's in charge of that.
Yeah.
So that is great, brother. Well, until next time, listeners, may the Lord guide you into all truth and may the Lord bless you.